I'm Brittany. It was my wedding day, a picture-perfect spring Saturday in May at a converted carriage house in the Berkshires. The weather was that rare, bright, and soft New England spring kind. I was wearing my grandmother's veil, which had been stored in my mother's attic for 35 years, and she'd silently handed it to me 2 weeks ago. The ceremony was beautiful. I hadn't planned to cry during my vows, but when my fiancé, Ryan, teared up first, I couldn't hold it back. My father walked me down the aisle, and at the end, instead of just lifting my veil and kissing my cheek, he held my face for an extra second and whispered, very quietly, "I'm sorry, kiddo." It was the first time in my life he'd ever apologized to me, and it almost made me lose it during the rest of the ceremony. Cocktail hour passed uneventfully, and dinner started at 6:30. Toasts were set for 7:15. But at 7:12 everything changed. 2 FBI agents in suits, badges clearly visible, walked calmly across the dance floor. The string quartet stopped playing on its own, as if they sensed the impending storm. Conversations died down, and people turned in their chairs. The lead agent, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair, went straight to my brother, Ethan's table. "Ethan," she said, "stand up, please." He stood, still holding a glass of red wine. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." I watched from the head table as Ethan's face contorted, just like it did in the lawyer's office almost a year ago. His then-girlfriend, Lily, slid her chair back, stood up, and walked out of the carriage house without a glance at him. My mother put her hands flat on the table and lowered her head. Ethan turned, still holding the wine glass, and looked at me across the room. In that look, I saw that he finally understood. He shouted, "You set me up." I picked up my glass of champagne, tilted it towards him, and said, "I let you set yourself up." The agents took him out the side door. The bookkeeper Ethan had paid to give a false speech accusing me of elder financial abuse was already gone. She'd realized something was wrong between the appetizer and the entree and quietly left for her car. Let me back up. I'm a speech therapist, working with kids, especially those on the autism spectrum. I make about $56,000 a year in the Boston suburbs, sharing a 1-bedroom apartment in Watertown with Ryan. We eat a lot of pasta, but we're happy. Ethan is 6 years older than me. Our family has always favored him. He went to a private high school, while I went to public. At 16, he got a brand new sports car, and I got my mother's old minivan when I turned 18, after working 2 summers to save for the registration fees. He got a graduation trip to Asia, and I got a small gift card and a quick hug. Our grandfather, Gramps, was a former construction worker who started a small commercial real estate company in the 80s. By the time he passed away at 88, the company owned about 14 mixed-use buildings in and around Springfield. Gramps was the only one in the family who really saw me. He drove an old Ford and always clipped coupons, but he'd slip me $20 bills at every birthday with a wink, saying, "Don't tell your brother." When Gramps got sick with lung cancer in the spring, I drove to Springfield 3 nights a week after work. I brought him soup he could barely eat and watched baseball with him on mute because the noise hurt his head. Ethan came twice. The second time, he brought Lily and took a selfie with Gramps' hospital bed in the background for his social media. Gramps passed away in late June. The funeral was on a Tuesday, and the reading of the will was the following Monday. We were in the conference room of an attorney's office in downtown Springfield. There was me, Ethan, my dad, my mom, my Aunt Vivian, Gramps' daughter, and her husband. The lawyer, an older man with thick glasses, opened the file. To everyone's shock, the bulk of the estate, the company, the buildings, everything, went to me. Not split, not shared. Just me. There was a clause stating that Gramps' decision was deliberate and not to be contested. Ethan got a bequest of $50,000, and there were smaller bequests for my parents and aunt, along with a charitable donation. I was sitting there in a simple black dress, suddenly the inheritor of a real estate company worth over $18 million. Ethan's face was a picture of disbelief and anger. He laughed, a disbelieving bark, and then turned to my father and said, "This is a joke, right? Dad, this can't be real." My father, who has always been silent when it matters, said nothing. My mother started crying, not because of Gramps' loss, but because their plans had fallen apart. Ethan left the office without saying goodbye. That night, he called me. "You manipulated him," he said without a hello. "You sat there week after week whispering in his ear while he was on painkillers and turned him against the family." I tried to explain that I'd just brought him soup, that Gramps was lucid until 2 days before he died, and that the will was drafted 3 years earlier when he was still going to the office on his own. He hung up on me. By Friday, my mother stopped returning my calls. By the following Wednesday, my Aunt Vivian unfriended me on Facebook. By the end of the month, I was quietly disinvited from a cousin's baby shower. Ethan had spread a story that I'd moved in on Gramps in his final months, isolated him from the family, pressured him into changing the will, and that I'd been a con artist all along. It was a story that flattered everyone who heard it. It made my mother feel betrayed instead of greedy, my aunt feel righteous instead of disappointed, and Ethan the wronged firstborn. I got engaged to Ryan the following month. We'd been together for 4 years, and he proposed at a beach in Maine with a ring he'd been saving for since our 2nd anniversary. I said yes before he even finished the question. We set the wedding for the following May, thinking there'd be plenty of time for things to calm down. How naive I was. In October, about 2 months after the will was finalized, Ryan got a phone call from a man who said he was a concerned family friend. He told Ryan that I had a history of manipulating older people for financial gain, that I was under investigation by Adult Protective Services, and that there were questions about my involvement in Gramps' death. Ryan asked for the man's name, and the man hung up. 2 weeks later, a woman approached me at a coffee shop near my office. She asked if I was the one who'd stolen from the old man, and she had a phone in her hand, probably recording. The worst came in mid-November. My boss, the director of the clinic where I worked, called me into her office and told me that someone had filed a complaint with the state licensing board, alleging that I'd been engaging in unethical conduct with elderly clients. We only work with children, so the complaint was absurd and was dismissed within a week. But my boss looked at me differently after that. In early December, Ryan and I were at my parents' house for an early Christmas dinner. Ethan was there with Lily, who was clearly over their relationship. Ethan made a big show of hugging me at the door and then pulled my father into the den for a private chat. I went to the bathroom, and the door to the den was cracked. I heard Ethan say, "I have someone on her. Parker's been on her since September." I stood there for about 90 seconds and heard him say, "He's got photos of her with the old man's lawyer. He's got the bank records. We just need a bit more before we go to the press." That night, in the car on the way back to Watertown, I told Ryan everything. He didn't question me, he just said, "Okay, we need a lawyer, a real one, tomorrow." The lawyer Ryan found was Miss Ava Thompson. She was a no-nonsense attorney who listened to my whole story. At the end, she said, "Your brother has hired a private investigator to create grounds for a will contest and plans to humiliate you publicly to force a settlement. We need to find out who the investigator is and get ahead of this." Ms. Thompson had a friend, Mr. Leo Harris, a former federal forensic accountant. She hired him on my behalf. It felt strange to use my money because most of the inheritance was still tied up in the company, but I had access to the operating accounts and had been signing payroll for 2 months. Mr. Harris first figured out that Ethan's investigator was Parker. He ran a small operation in Lowell and, in Mr. Harris's opinion, was a shady character who'd been disciplined by the state licensing board twice. He'd definitely take a side payment if offered. Then, Mr. Harris started looking into Ethan. I'd mentioned to him that Gramps had once told me about a loan he'd given to a young man Ethan had introduced him to. Gramps had said, "Your brother's friend with the sharp suit. Mr. Harris found that loan, which was for $240,000. It was issued to a Shell LLC, and the signatory was a man named Derek Clark, but the operating address on the loan paperwork was Ethan's apartment. The money was wired out to 3 separate accounts, 2 offshore, the same week it was received. There were 6 more such loans. Ethan had been using Gramps' company as a money laundering vehicle for a Ponzi scheme run by the man in the sharp suit for about 18 months before Gramps got sick. Ethan wasn't the mastermind, he was just the middleman. He'd convinced Gramps, who was old and trusting, to give out low collateral loans that would never be repaid and took a cut from each wire transfer. In total, about $1.6 million was funneled through the company. Mr. Harris called me into Ms. Thompson's office one Thursday afternoon and walked me through everything. I sat there, looking at a spreadsheet, and cried a little because Gramps had loved Ethan so much. Ms. Thompson asked me what I wanted to do. I thought about my mother's cold shoulder, the woman at the coffee shop, and my boss's skeptical look. I said, "I want to give it to the FBI. Ms. Thompson nodded and said, "Good. That's the right answer, but we need to time it." We found out through Mr. Harris's surveillance of Parker that Ethan was planning something at the wedding. Parker was supposed to be on the site, and Ethan had paid the venue's banquet manager $1,000 to let a special guest speak at the reception. The special guest was a woman who used to do part-time bookkeeping for Gramps' company in the 90s. Ethan had convinced her, probably with cash and lies, to stand up and accuse me of elder financial abuse. What Ethan didn't know was that Parker had been turned. Mr. Harris had paid him 3 times what Ethan was paying, and in return, Parker had been giving us copies of his reports to Ethan and recordings of their meetings since November. Massachusetts is a 2-party consent state, and Parker had the right to record. Ms. Thompson had also filed all the evidence, including the loan documents, wire transfers, and Mr. Harris's analysis, with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston 3 weeks before the wedding. The FBI took the case and asked us to keep quiet and not tip Ethan off. So, on that fateful wedding day, when the FBI walked in and arrested Ethan, it was the result of his own actions. The reception somehow went on. Ryan and I had our first dance. My father gave a short and clumsy toast and ended up crying. My new mother-in-law came up to me during the cake cutting and said, "Sweetheart, you did the right thing." Ethan pleaded out the following winter. He got 6.5 years at a federal facility in Pennsylvania, plus restitution he'll never realistically pay back. The man in the sharp suit got 11 years, and a few others got smaller sentences. The company, Gramps' company, which is now mine, was cleared of liability because we self-reported and the loans were issued under false pretenses. I ran it while keeping my speech therapy job for the first year, but running 14 mixed-use buildings is a full-time job. Last September, I went part-time at the clinic so I could do both. I kept a few of my favorite kids on my caseload, I just can't let them go. My mother and I are on better terms now. About 4 months after the wedding, she came to my kitchen table and cried for almost an hour. She finally said, "I think I always knew about Ethan. I just didn't want to know." I held her hand and made her tea. We're slowly rebuilding our relationship. My Aunt Vivian still hasn't spoken to me. I sent her a card on her birthday and at Christmas, hoping one day she'll come around. My father takes me to lunch every other Wednesday. He doesn't say much, but he shows up, and that's enough for me. Ryan and I bought a house last spring, a real one with a yard. We're talking about having kids. I've learned that people who underestimate you are giving you a gift. They show you exactly how they'll lose. I'm not the same woman I was the day Gramps' lawyer read out the will. I'm stronger, clearer, and actually kinder. I've learned that decency and patience aren't weaknesses, but you also have to be smart and have the courage to do the right thing when it matters. And I know that the truth always finds its way out.